Sophie Murdoch. Thanks very much, Art. Just to briefly introduce myself again, my name is Sophie Murdoch, and I head up the market access practice within Alliance. And what we're going to do today is really talk to you and present to you some findings from I'd say a rather intriguing survey that we recently conducted, all within the idea of helping industry, and when I say industry I'm talking about the pharmaceutical and the medical device industry, really helping them transform their market access strategy, their market access function, and how they actually look at improving their implementation and planning. So with that said, what I'd very much like to do is to introduce you throughout the presentation to the structure. And first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to, if I can just move this down, hold on a second. Can people see my screen? Okay, hopefully you can. So what we're going to do, as Art just briefly mentioned, we've got 4 key areas of the presentation, and we'll first of all talk a bit about why access fails. We'll go into the survey itself, the results of the survey, what that means, as in the learnings from the survey, and then finally looking at some performance measurement in terms of how you, potentially within your company, or maybe you as an individual, how you actually stack up against what's happening at the moment within the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. So let's look first of all at why access fails. And I think, like any good consultant, what we normally do when we start a piece of work, one of the things we do is a very thorough understanding of the environment, and that involves quite a bit of desktop research, quite a bit of analysis to try to really understand what's going on. And as part of this, one of the things that I certainly came up with when I was looking at product launches and specifically failures in product launches, I came up with this particular quote, which I'm going to show you here now. It's 3 years old, from the Harvard Business Review, but is very much still, for me, a really pure academic perspective on launching. So what you can see here is the Harvard Business Review and some of the authors saying, well, you know, maybe you should actually just tell management that they should postpone a launch. And I think for those of you who actually work in industry, for those of you who could actually manage going to your board or to your senior management, those that have been tasked with actually developing the access strategy and launching a product, to go to them and suggest this, I'm not sure if many people would be quite confident in actually going to do that. And there are many reasons why, including this on the next slide. And you'll see here the amount of investment that goes into bringing a drug to the market. Now, there have been many quotes in terms of the amount of resource that it takes to bring a drug to market. Famous one, Diwali in sort of around 2000s had this figure of 1 billion. This recent study here that was conducted was saying that around $4 to $5 billion in costs are spent on average for a successful drug that's launched. Now, I just mentioned the word on average because some companies spend much more than others. Perhaps they are more effective, perhaps they are more efficient, perhaps also they have more revenue from their drug as well. But in essence, what this is really showing us is that the stakes are high. There's so much spending that goes in, there's so much resource that goes in. Certainly from a patient perspective, there's a lot of hope that goes into drug development, and the idea that market access can actually help and support this process, but not actually that, make it more efficient, I think is something that is very appealing to the pharmaceutical industry. So bearing this in mind, we really wanted to find out a little bit more, and as I mentioned, not really just from that academic perspective of textbook, well, we're not ready, so let's postpone. Well, welcome to the real world where actually every single minute, every single day is costing money, and therefore what you should be doing is looking at how can we make the process more effective, how can we make the process more efficient to make us successful. What I want to do is to show you a couple of examples from industry that really, for me, I guess sum up what actually happens when access can fail. And also what happens when it can be a real success. So first of all, looking at Benlysta, and maybe apologies or not for people from GSK on the line, let me just give you a brief background. So GSK were developing this drug, Benlysta, and it was for a rare disease. Not only a rare disease, but one with very limited treatment options. So some products available in certain markets, maybe some approved, maybe some not approved, but in essence, clearly there was an unmet need for an efficacious and a safe treatment. So if we're thinking about, I guess if you almost want to call it a tick box exercise for why is a drug being developed and is there a need for it, this one is clearly satisfying a need. So what did that mean? You would think that if we take for HTAs, which we've got here, we've got France, Germany, Scotland and England. If you look at those 4 authorities, you might imagine to see 4 green boxes down the left-hand side, with the assumption that, well, this is a rare disease, it's a drug where there's very limited treatment options available, and there's a high clinical unmet need. But what you can see there is not 4 green boxes, rather a multicoloured approach with some reds and an amber. So let's just go through and see what that means. First of all, in France, what happened? Well, the company, the drug got granted a conditional reimbursement, and it wasn't actually a full reimbursement, it was a conditional reimbursement on the promise that some additional data came back post-launch. Okay, we're giving that one a green light. What happened in Germany was, first of all, GBA commissioned IQWiG. They had a look at the file, and they actually decided that this particular drug, bearing in mind some of the safety issues that came up, they actually looked at this and said that they didn't see an additional benefit. Now, in this particular instance, the GBA overruled IQWiG, and I think for those of you who are familiar with the German system, this has happened. This isn't an isolated incident. This has happened before. And what happened was that the GBA really did a bit of a full circle here in that they granted a significant additional benefit. But what happened afterwards is that in order to actually pull the drug through, GSK ended up conceding quite a significant discount on this drug as part of the benefit process, assessment process, and the price negotiations that they entered into. So you could argue, well, maybe that should be a green light there. I think it's probably more of an amber because the process that they went through was relatively protracted, and the price negotiations, I'm sure GSK, if there are people there, would agree or disagree with me that in essence, I think they would have preferred not to be conceding such a significant discount. What happened in Scotland? The SMC in Scotland, they recommended against the use of the product because they had concerns over the data that was submitted. And in England, there was a difficult situation in England in that the English authorities, what they wanted to see, they actually wanted to see the comparator used in the models as being rituximab. Now this was relatively interesting because rituximab is not an approved therapy for this disease. And that caused an interesting situation because on one hand you think, well, okay, it's fair enough to have the comparator and demanding the comparator to be something that is approved and that is readily used. But on the other hand, if it's not the standard of care that is approved, is it really fair to be that to be considered as the standard of care? And actually, in NICE's case, they said, yes, it is, because we have consulted our experts and we recognize that, okay, the product is actually off-label, but it is the standard of care that is perceived throughout the land. And therefore, they actually didn't approve the drug. So there's a fairly interesting situation in when you actually have a look at some of the different parameters that are used by these HTAs. and you see what's coming through, that there are some issues certainly with the comparator, but the trial design and the data coming out of that trial design really did cause an impact for GSK with this particular drug. And certainly, I know that where they had hoped to be in terms of their access and their uptake is definitely not where they are now. And I think a few years ago, certainly the industry might have thought that actually having an orphan status might confer certain benefits. As we move forward into the future and we see more of the austerity trends, I think the orphan drug status doesn't necessarily confer the benefits that maybe it did in 2006 when Genzyme were launching Myozyme. So let's have a look at another example, and one which I think is a very positive example of how a company have really partnered with patient associations and partnered with other key stakeholders to make their drug a success. And I'm talking here about Vertex with their drug Kalydeco. So this is another orphan drug, but more of an even rarer disease in that it's targeting a very small percentage of the cystic fibrosis patients. And what happened here was that Vertex developed this drug, but they didn't just develop it on their own, they developed it in very strong partnership and collaboration with the Cystic Fibrosis Organization. And what they did was that they truly partnered with different patient organizations throughout the whole development. So it wasn't that they all of a sudden got to the end of phase 3 or they got to phase 3 and thought, whoa, we need to do some stakeholder identification here, we need to do some stakeholder mapping and work out which kind of patient groups we should be talking to. This was a different story. This was really a hand-in-hand development that went really from the lab all the way through to actually developing and in actual use. So quite a different story here. And what you'll see is perhaps a reflection of that with the HTA assessments. So let me explain a little bit more. We've got the same 4 HTAs that I referred to in the previous slide. First of all, France and the Transparency Commission, they granted an ASMR rating of 2, which I think people will agree if you actually have a look at the number of ASMR ratings of 1 and 2 that the French authorities have granted over the past few years. It's a very, very minor number. So this was a great result. In Germany, what happened? The GBA split the verdict. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, hold on a minute, I thought there was a limit in terms of the financial turnover for an orphan drug in Germany that means that drugs are devoid of going through the benefit assessment. Well, actually what happened in this case was that there was a disagreement in terms of the potential value of this drug, and that was to do with some concerns that the German authorities had over the epidemiology figures. So again, whilst the company have done really what they can with the patient organisations to help and shape the drug and make sure that the clinical design was appropriate, where they fell down a little bit here was in terms of the epidemiology that was used, in that the German authorities were not convinced that the numbers that Vertex had put in front of them were right, and they thought that the actual likely numbers were going to be higher than the one that Vertex had submitted. So they ended up going through a full assessment, and actually as a result of that they split the verdict. Again, something that the German authorities have been doing quite a lot over the past few assessment reviews that they have completed. In England, what happened there, it was a relatively protracted process, but what happened here was that the special commissioning groups, they did approve the drug, and it was after a scheme that was developed, a patient access scheme, or shall we call them a discount, that was offered by the company and accepted. And what happened in Scotland, the last one there, they didn't recommend usage, and this was really, again, another protracted discussion, a lot of lobbying, a lot of involvement by the patient groups. And what happened in the end was that whilst the SMC are still not recommending the product for use in Scotland, what they actually did was that they reviewed and they have amended the way that they approve drugs and they review drugs in Scotland. They created a rare medicines fund, and which essentially means that whilst the drug is not recommended for use, there is a pot of money, the fund, is actually used to be able to provide access to patients in Scotland. So still, what happened, I think, really from the very strong collaboration that Vertex had with the patient groups, they were able to use those groups and engage with those groups to get a win-win result for the company and obviously most importantly for the patients. A few concerns there over cost effectiveness if you actually have a look at the different parameters and which one of those came up. But in essence, if you compare it with the previous slide, with the concerns over the comparator, the endpoints, the data, etc., this really shows an organisation that had considered and very much thought about what they needed to provide. And I think this is an important point here, is that when organisations are going to engage with patient groups or engage with key opinion leaders, what is really valued, and I think working towards a win-win situation for all, is developing into a partnership as opposed to a short-term engagement, because that really provides long-lasting results, as you can see from the SMC there. Okay, let's move on, because that's given us a bit of an understanding, or at least a bit of a framework and a background in terms of why access can be so challenging. So what does that actually mean? Well, first of all, I think we've seen there are only 4 HTAs there that I used as an example, but if you have a look at those HTAs, they use different parameters to make decisions, and it's a very diverse environment out there. So what might work for NICE might not work for SMC, might not work for the Transparency Commission, might not work for a whole variety of different organisations. And it's not just the diversity, but also the fact that the HTAs are changing. They change all the time. We have a look at what happened with France in October last year and bringing in the economic evaluations. That's a very different system now than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And the rules of the game really are constantly changing, and it's difficult to keep your finger on the pulse of all of these different countries and the changes that go on. The second one is, and we hear this a lot, austerity. It's bandied around a lot, but it is an increasingly restrictive environment out there, and every penny does essentially count, and so value these days needs to be justified and needs to be understood. But that really comes up with another difficulty, which is, what does value mean? And we only have to look at the example that's in the UK, where they have debated for a long time now over value-based pricing, which is now value-based assessment, but we still don't have a concrete understanding of exactly what that is. The same with innovation. There have been some trying by different organisations, different authorities, to come up with how they define innovation. I think recently the Italian example, IFA came up with an incredibly complicated algorithm to go through and understand what is innovation. And still it's not clear. So I think that there's a struggling with the definitions, not just necessarily within a country, but across a region as well, as to what different words and what different terminology actually means. The next thing, as well, as we've seen with the Benlysta case, is that it's difficult to generate the right evidence, and what's right for one country might not be right for another country, and what's right for one health authority at a national level might not be relevant for an authority at a regional level. And again, Spain is a good example here. We look at Soliris, another orphan drug. We look at that was actually granted full reimbursement at a national level. As you start to go down to a regional level, There are really pockets of access that have been granted because the regional health authorities cannot afford the drug. So they've come up with different assessments. And therefore, the right evidence is a difficult concept because it very much is dependent upon who your actual customer is, who your stakeholder is. And the last point is certainly within industry, the politics make everything far more complicated in terms of personalities, in terms of emotions. A lot of the time, certainly dealing with clients, it can take 10 years to get a drug to launch, okay, and a lot of that might be actually spent in the lab. But even when you get to phase 3, commercial employees have been working sometimes for many years on a drug, and it's difficult to sort of break away the emotional connection with working on a drug, with working on a therapy area, to the actual objective and tangible assessment that perhaps sometimes is more warranted. So these are just some factors, certainly, that we pull out from that foundation and from that landscape that tell us that, okay, access is difficult. What we wanted to do was to actually find out from industry. We wanted to find out, well, okay, well, this is what we think, this is what we see going on, but what do you think? Give us some more depth, give us some more understanding here in some of the challenges that you perceive. So we conducted a survey, and we conducted a survey. It ran over 3 to 4 months, and this was across industry. So I mentioned right at the start, we consider industry as being the pharmaceutical industry and the medical device industry. So we spoke to a variety of different people that either sit in pricing roles, reimbursement roles, market access roles, health economics roles, and also policy as well. In fact, we even included a few people from marketing roles in here as well, to really get a good and a robust understanding of what you believe some of the challenges to be. And I was blown away a little bit by the response rate to this, because it's clearly something that people find very close to their heart and that want to talk about and find out more about. So the survey was very simple. We asked 2 questions. Number 1, challenges. So what are the biggest challenges that you perceive, really focusing in on the price, reimbursement and market access perspective, so honing in on that. What are the biggest challenges you perceive when you're actually launching a drug, or maybe having a line extension to an existing drug? And then we ask the same question, but in terms of key success factors. So what are the big key success factors with launching a new drug or a line extension? And this is what we found. So we were quite interested in the way that the responses came back, and I'll talk to you first about the challenges, and then we'll move on to the key success factors. So from the challenges, we broke these down into 4 different categories. First of all, the environment, and you can see the various different subcategories that come up there. The changing environment, I just mentioned that, increasing restrictions, the gaining the local access, so not necessarily what happens at a national level, but in the Spanish example I just referred to, whether you actually, that pulls down through into a local level. The emerging markets and the pricing and differentiated pricing there, and also reference pricing, and trying to get a handle on reference pricing, not just necessarily maybe in 2014, but what's the likely impact going to be in 2015, 2016. So the environment was a key area. The second was process, and by process what we really mean is within an organisation, how does that then work? So internal communication, I think for those of you who work within a large organisation, this is always a challenge, as well as global to local. So that in essence means what happens at a global level, how does that translate down to, how does that align with the local strategy and vice versa? And then also the last one there is balancing the commercial and the payer goals, which in essence means, okay, we as a company want to achieve X, Y, and Z. The payer might want to achieve A, B, and C. So how do we actually get those 2 goals to work together? The third area was people, the third big key area. Resource, obviously, that's I think that will come up time and time again wherever you are. But also the experience and expertise, and I think maybe this comes down to the fact that market access is still a relatively new function. If you look at some of the functions that exist within a pharma industry, it's relatively new. So I think that the lack of experience and expertise is something that people find quite challenging. And the last is the evidence. Innovative product, we just talked about what does innovation actually mean, but being able to generate the right evidence and then also doing it in a way that actually demonstrates value for the payer. So there were the 4 categories that we came up with in some of the subcategories. Let's just have a look on the next slide in terms of how that breaks down. Well, if you actually have a look, the biggest challenge that comes up then in terms of the categories is evidence, followed by the environment, and people and process pretty much similar. But evidence is really over a third of the challenges appear to be to do with finding the right evidence. And if we have a look specifically at some of the responses that came up, what you can see here, 3 areas that are key. Evidence generation, that's obviously very important, as well as demonstrating value, and then also the experience and the expertise. So if we come and have a look, and what I want to do here is to share with you some specifics in terms of some of the things that people are actually saying. We've kept this anonymous, obviously, but I want to share with you some of the actual comments that people were making, because I think this really helps to add some granularity and some understanding to what your peers, in essence, are struggling with. So evidence generation, I just said that before, but it's really about how do you do it in a way that really means something to our payer stakeholders, as well as the environment. We talked about that right at the start. It's very diverse, it's always changing, and it's very difficult to keep up with that. And even in larger companies who have clearly a greater infrastructure and more resource, is a challenge, but it's a challenge in small companies as well. So let's have a look at some of the quotes that come up here. On the left-hand side, you can see some of the evidence. Is value-based pricing a reality? Well, no, I don't think so. And I was talking to somebody from NICE the other day who was saying exactly that. You know, it's still very much under review, and people really still trying to understand what it actually value-based assessment really means. I think as well, the other thing that's quite key, if we stick on the evidence area, is really doing it in a way that's meaningful. And it's challenging for industry to do it in a way that's meaningful, because that in essence is adding significant risk to what they're doing. And okay, a payer might want to see a head-to-head study, they might want to see overall survival, where in actuality a progression-free survival or perhaps a non-comparative head-to-head might be a much less risky and a more indicative way for industry to conduct a clinical trial. So it's really trying to find that area or that balance that's going to give the payer what they need, but also is going to allow a company to do it without exposing them to too much risk. So talked before about the level of experience and expertise, and I think maybe you might understand that as well, but I think one of the things with market access I mentioned before is relatively new, and with any area that's relatively new, it sort of seems to be a bit sexy, a bit got the spotlight on it. What often happens is that you see people within organisations being pulled through the ranks, and before it always used to be people in sales who were good went into marketing, and then maybe they got a country manager role and they went up like that. And what often happens is that maybe somebody who was good in sales is not necessarily good in marketing, or is not necessarily good at country management. This happens here in that with market access you might get somebody who is perceived to be a high achiever, and they're dragged through different functions within the organisation. They spend a little bit of time in market access, but not enough to truly understand the area or to make an impact or to make a difference. And so this is definitely one of those where we certainly perceive a gap in terms of the knowledge base. Also, it can work in the converse, where you have some pockets in companies where you have incredibly experienced individuals in market access that have been doing it for a long time, and that's great, because it really does help give, I think, the company a good understanding of what's achievable and what's possible. And then actually having a look at the last area, the process, the last quote I'll just refer to there. I think this is something else that comes through, is that senior management maybe are perceived to live in a little bit of a bubble sometimes, and have an expectation on, okay, what we think the price could be, that might be based on very old assumptions or very old data, that might be based upon how they've done their calculations in terms of the revenue that they need to come up with, but it might actually be completely devoid from reality. So really being able to tie down those expectations from senior management and say, well, what does this actually mean, and what do we need to do to achieve this, is something that I think a lot of organisations struggle with. Nobody wants to be the one to go to the big boss and say, well, actually, that's not going to work. It's a challenging thing to have to do. Okay, let's move on to the key success factors, and again, I'm going to look at 4 categories. So first one, the offering, and by that I don't just mean the product. It could be the product and the service, it could be a diagnostic, it could be whatever the company is basically offering to the stakeholders. The process and the people, so that you'll see an overlap here between the other one, but some others, some other different areas came through. So internal visibility and the experience and expertise, we had that before, but in addition, cross-functional collaboration. We see a lot of silos going on, siloed activities, and some feedback that came through was very much, wow, when we've got all of the teams working together and truly working together, that's where we see a difference. As well as early planning, which again is a difficult one when you're actually looking at, well, how do you actually resource that? The market knowledge, pretty much linked to what we were talking about before in terms of, okay, if you really know it and you have some experienced people and you're able to see maybe what the trends are and the trends in the future, you're able to truly understand your stakeholder, then that's something that very much makes a difference. And the last one, the evidence, we saw that before, but here it's not necessarily just providing the evidence that's valuable, it's doing it in a way that's not necessarily just within the clinical trial setting. It's not necessarily just looking at the clinical evidence, but understanding, well, how does that relate to health economic outcomes as well? And also in a way that's not necessarily at a global level or European level, but is very much looking at what does that mean for a local country. So here, what we see is nearly half of the key success factors were related to the process and the people category. So pretty significant, I think that you will agree. I'll explore some of these in some more detail. The 2 biggies that came up, stakeholder communication and the relationship building, that was something from an external perspective. But then internally, you'll see here, I thought this is quite interesting, is that the global to regional communication and the visibility on what's happening was really something that the industry, your peers, believed to be one of the key success factors for market access. It's truly understanding what is going on and what are the plans and what do these actually mean. So one of the things that I was a little bit blown away by was the fact that an innovative product didn't actually score on the list. In fact, I think 1 or 2 people might have actually said about the product itself. And this was something that was really surprising. In fact, if you look at this quote on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, and you'll see here, rare opportunity to have an innovative drug. And I wonder whether that means that the industry actually do believe that there are very few truly innovative drugs, that they are few and far between, or is it that actually there are so many other aspects to market access that you can't just rest and rely on having an innovative drug. There are so many other things you need to do to make it a success. The product on its own is not going to do it. And I think we've seen that I see that time and time again when you actually have a look at some companies and some of the drugs that they have, that even with some of them with relatively good data, they're still not getting the access. So I sort of, whilst I put that on out there and say, well, maybe actually having a product, having a really great product is not just the be all and end all, I think what we've seen and the difference in HTA assessments and reviews means that actually, yeah, there's much more to having a successful launch than a brilliant product. As well, the customer, and I mean, this sounds quite an obvious one for people who have been involved in any kind of front-facing activity, a sales or a marketing-related activity. Of course, connecting with your customer is essential. Here, with the payer stakeholder is really truly understanding who they are, what makes them tick, what are their motivations, but also importantly, what are the limitations that they work within, because you need to understand what those are to allow you to work with them too. Let's have a look at some of the quotes that I picked out here. So on market knowledge, talking and understanding directly from the payers, not just referring to what the payer influencers, the KOLs or some of the key clinicians are saying, but really getting a true understanding from the payer themselves. Also, if we're looking about the process and the people, I think what's quite clear coming through here is looking at what I was talking before, that global to local visibility and understanding, and really from the global team. I think what often happens is that they almost exist within a bubble. You know, they're working on certain brand or they're working on certain therapeutic area strategies, and it doesn't necessarily, the true essence of that doesn't necessarily get communicated down to affiliates. And if you're in the affiliate role, what we found when we spoke to a few people is that there's a certain level of frustration that they don't get to see the full picture. And I'm sure you'll agree, when you try to do something without fully understanding the picture or what you're helping to actually build, it's not as effective. It's never going to be as effective. So the communication, the ability to be able to have that flowing is something that was quite important. So what does this actually mean? Well, we've boiled this down to three main areas, and the first one is the customer. Really knowing your customer inside out, upside down. So first of all, number one, identifying them. Who actually are they? And it's not just necessarily understanding who they are, because I think we talked about it before, the resources are clearly limited in different companies. So it's not just understanding who they are, but also prioritizing them, and prioritizing them for their benefit as well as for yours. The values and the beliefs. What do they value, and how do they actually think? Because you need to know what they value. It's no point them you thinking, well, they're going to value PFS data, and actually you're coming up with something a totally different endpoint. So you really need to understand what they value and also how they think, because how they think might allow you to give them something that's more reasonable and more feasible for you, which is still fitting within their value system. Also the constraints, I mentioned this just before, but you need to understand their limitations, because again, this helps you understand, well, if they've only got a budget of 50 million or 20 million, then coming up with a proposal where you are expecting them to spend 100 million clearly is not going to work. So you need to find some way to be able to work within their constraints, and also their motivation. You help them to help you. If there's something that they need to do to help you gain access, then find out what that is and find out what they need to be able to motivate it to move into action. The second one is developing the evidence, and again, this clearly came up as the biggest issue in terms of the challenges. So making it compelling, what really, once you've understood the values and beliefs, what really does then make an impact on them? How can I make it meaningful? How do I develop that trial design to make it meaningful? With the Benlysta case, what they did was that they didn't look at at the most critical patients, the most severe patients. They looked at a broader patient population. That wasn't meaningful enough to many payers, and that's actually why some of the HTA evaluations failed. But also believable as well. Can I believe you? Can I believe the data that you've put together? Is it relevant? Am I going to think, actually, I want you to provide me a comparator against rituximab? Otherwise, I don't believe it's relevant. So find out what they want before you actually start spending all of this resource, spending all of this time in putting it together. And the last area is really understanding what you need to do internally. Clear communication. So first of all, strategy, defining your strategy. What actually is your plan? And I would like everybody on this call to be asking themselves, do you really know? Can you verbalize your plan very clearly in just one sentence, or maybe even 3 points to understand what is your strategy? Because sometimes people do not have a very clear understanding of what that is. Challenge yourself on that. The roles and responsibilities. Who is going to be doing this? Actually, have they even got the experience to do it? Are they able to do it? The person that I've asked to do, are they even going to be able to do it? When do they need to do it? Do they really need to do it now, or can they wait? Should they have done it 2 years ago? The implementation is also important in terms of the how. How will they actually do this, as well as the contingencies? So if it all goes wrong, what actually are they going to do to be able to fix it? And they really are the 3 things. I think that if you were to just go away with 3 things, I mean, obviously there's probably many more, I think this would be a great start to help transform the way that companies do and that you do maybe manage market access. I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes looking at performance indicators, because again, this is something that often we have our clients say to us, well, how then actually do you do that? Because clearly there's a way of measuring performance post-launch. You look at the sales, you look at how long did it take us to get access, what kind of reimbursement do we get? Did we get the full label? Do we get a partial label? What do we actually get? You can look at more sort of sales and advertising metrics that say, well, what's the awareness rate? What do we actually get here? What's the recall? What's the prompted, unprompted recall, etc., etc.? And they're great once you've actually launched a product. But as we just said before, there's 10 years leading up to that time, and there's a significant amount of 4 to 5 billion worth of investment. So how do you make sure when you're actually going through that process that you're moving in the right direction? And I think what's really important is looking at performance indicators, and we break those down into 3. So the people, the process, the technology. So the people, this is all about the how. How do you do it? So what kind of people do you need to have in place? If we're looking at somebody in the US, we're looking at putting somebody in Italy, what do they need to be able to do? Not just necessarily what kind of activities, the role and the responsibility, but how do we want them? Do we want them to already have relationships with key stakeholders? Do we want to have them that they've had to have done market access for 1 or 2 years? Or are we quite happy because we've got such a strong foundation of access in Italy and the US, we're quite happy taking somebody from the sales force? Really truly understanding what kind of performance metrics you want them to look at. The same with process and the same with technology. I'm not going to beat this one to death, but I think that the whole point of this is really providing some kind of an objective way to look at how you are performing and what does operational excellence look like. And really this takes a while for you to sort of take your foot off the gas for a minute and doing all of these things and sort of step back and say, okay, well, if we were to start again, or if I were to plan this again, what would great really look like? What would operational excellence look like? And take stock of that, and also put some tangible measurements down to help you see where you stack up. And that's in essence what we do, is we help our companies and our clients really understand, well, where do they stack up, and are they actually doing quite well across the board, or have they got some countries that are underperforming, overperforming, etc., and really helping you understand how you actually stack up, and are you tracking in the right way to really transform your market access strategy and transform the implementation and planning that you put into action. So with that said, that is that concludes certainly the webinar and the presentation of the survey results. What I'd like to do is just to turn over to Art just to see if there are any questions coming through. I think we've got got 10 minutes left.
Hi, Sophie. I do have a couple questions for you. Just before we do that, just a couple things just for the people, just in case anyone drops off the line. We are going to make the presentation video available to everyone who attended, as well as a white paper on the survey. So those will be coming your way likely tomorrow. Okay, so with that being said, Sophie, first question. How do you typically approach benchmarking for smaller companies against larger players in the industry for a fair comparison?
Yeah, that's a good question because they are different, very different. And what we do is we split into two. We look at internal benchmarking and external benchmarking. So internal benchmarking, I think I talked about before when I was going through the survey, is that often what we see is that some clients have a very siloed approach to the way that they manage and do market access. So it might be they have one drug and the team focusing in on that drug. There might also be within a therapy area, oncology, there might be another team that have been working on another drug that have had some really good insights because they've just launched that drug. But because they work in such a siloed approach, they don't necessarily share them with the other team. So what we do is we look at internal benchmarking. And obviously that's for larger companies, or at least those with more drugs, but to help get some kind of comparison and to also help continuous improvement within the organisation. But with the other type of benchmarking we do is external, so we look at similar types of companies. So for a small company, for example, say it was a biotech, we wouldn't necessarily be comparing those with the likes of a Pfizer or a Sanofi or some of the big names. We would be looking at a similar sized company where those parameters and the indicators could be considered fair, shall we say.
Okay, great. So one other question for you. From an HR perspective, where should market access sit in the organization?
Oh gosh, I don't know who's asked this question, but this was the same as we had a while ago that we presented the survey first when it first came out, and this was a really big debate that we had. Where should market access sit, and should it sit within the commercial function? Should it sit within the medical function? Where should it actually sit? And there were really two sort of camps. One was, well, it absolutely should sit within a particular function, and the other camp was, well, actually it should just be a philosophy, it should just be the way that the organisation thinks and acts. And I think that latter one is it's a nice theory to have, but again it almost goes back to the academics I was talking about at the start. It's a very theoretical concept. Often what you need within an organisation is to actually have a function that you can have a process around, that you can measure, that you can see objectively, well, how is that performing? Are we up to scratch? Do we need to be doing something else to really improve where we are? Are we tracking okay in all our different countries? Is it that we're actually underperforming in a certain area of market access? So whilst I think it's, from a philosophy, it's a great position to have. Yeah, everybody should own access, of course they should. Actually, from an accountability perspective, I think it definitely should sit within a particular functional area within the organisation. And one thing that I would actually suggest is that really it is a function within its own right. And I would love to see market access being a profession in its own right, with continuing professional development and any of the other attributes that you associate with other professions, because this is serious, not only serious for the industry in that it costs them billions of dollars, but also serious for patients as well. So I think it's an area that really I would hope to be seen taken more and more seriously in the future, and to have qualified professionals in this specific area.
Okay, I have another question for you that just came in. Why are CEA studies not widely used in the U.S.? What do you see as the future trends in this area?
Okay, so cost effectiveness studies, and the US is a very particular animal, and obviously that's going through some significant changes with the Affordable Care Act. I honestly do see the cost effectiveness analysis being used in increasingly in the US. I think that if you actually have a look at some payer policies, then they are increasingly wanting to see evidence from a cost perspective that it works, so the products work. So at the moment it's not been needed. As we move into the future and as policy changes, it will increasingly be needed. And as the US look to other systems and the way that other healthcare systems have worked, including those in Europe, I think that what will happen is that the US will start to mirror some of what's been happening in Europe with the health economic approaches. So I think that perhaps they haven't been used to date because they haven't been needed, but absolutely they will be needed more and more in the future.
Okay, and a couple more questions are still rolling in. So next one, the survey downplayed innovation as a KSF. How do you define innovation, and from the industry perspective or from a payer perspective?
Okay, that's an excellent question. How do I define innovation from the industry perspective and from the payer perspective? Yeah, that was the question? Just want to make sure I understood that.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, okay. So I think from the payer perspective, one of the things that they expect innovation to be is a revolution and not an evolution. So one of the things that payers see is slight changes in improvement. So if we're looking at, I talked about oncology just before, PFS, so progression-free survival. If we look at that and we see PFS of, let's say, 3.6 months, and another drug comes along with PFS of 4.1 months, that for a payer is not an innovative improvement. It's not an innovation. It represents an improvement. Of course it does. And if you're a patient, clearly you might want to be living another 3 or 4 weeks, depending on any kind of side effects that you might have. I mean, that's by the by. But what we're seeing is an evolutionary change. It's a slight improvement. It's not going from a 3.1 months to a 3.1 years. And I think that's often what payers want to see is larger jumps. They want to see revolution, and that's often how they equate innovation with a really big step change in the way that a therapy is treated. So I'll give you an example, and the likes of Herceptin was considered by many payers as an innovative approach to the way that oncology was treated, the way that cancer, sorry, was treated. So that's the way that they see it is a big change. I think from an industry perspective, it's much more diluted, because often they're dealing a lot with the front end. They're dealing with the patients themselves, and that 3.6 to 4.1 months, there might be somebody that is absolutely the 3 weeks. I mean, that to them means absolutely everything. That for them is an innovation. So it's a very different perspective that the industry have versus the one that payers have, and I think that the payer perspective is a much more strict perspective.
Okay, great. So we still got questions rolling in, so let's take another one. You talked about skills and experience. When you find the team that does not or may be lacking on those skills and experience, how do you balance the tasks that need to be performed day in and day out?
Okay, so we've got underperforming teams, and you say, right, what needs to happen with tasks?
So it's actually, so I think the question is actually framed, the team may or may not be lacking the skills.
Okay.
But how do you balance the tasks relevant, I guess, to also managing the skill sets of your team?
Okay, so this is a wonderful question, and I think often what happens is that people assume that their colleagues that work within the pharmaceutical industry are brilliant and they can do everything and anything, whereas in actuality they might have a job and they might have got a job that perhaps is out of their experience level and certainly out of their comfort level. So one of the things that's incredibly important to do just while you're at the planning stage, and this goes back to the measures, is what does operational excellence look like? What do those people need to have? What kind of skills and experience do they need to have to be able to do it? So when you're putting your planning and implementation together, you are considering not just what you do, but you're considering the people that are going to do it. You're considering the process in terms of the way that you're going to do it, and you're considering the technology that you use to optimize it. So it really should go down to right at the start. I think this early planning was one of the KSFs that came up as well. Do it at the start and make sure that you consider the skills and the experience level that you have. And if you've got gaps, then fill them, flag them and fill them. And I think that's one of the benefits of having a tangible assessment measure, the performance measures. One of the ways that keeping it objective helps you, because it gives you a more valid instrument to go to senior management and say, well, we've got some serious gaps here. We need to address them, otherwise we're going to have an issue. So it can work. It can work very much in your favour. I know we're out of time. Art, I don't know. Did you?
So we actually said one more question. So I think we'll just do that one real quick. Did the research discuss what types of evidence generation industry should prioritize for payers versus regulators? So, for example, phase 3, registry, other real-world data.
No, we didn't touch on that, actually. We didn't look at access versus regulatory approval. But one of the things that we very much want to do is we want to do another survey, and we want to have a look at some different areas within the industry, because clearly this is something that's key to people, that's very close to their heart. So what I would very much like to suggest, if people have some ideas and areas that they would like to find out more, then let us know and we can look at conducting that. And I think that one is a very good idea for a follow-on survey.
Okay, great. So that's all the questions. Like you said, we're actually just exactly out of time now. So Sophie, I'd like to thank you for a great presentation. Fantastic job, and I think everyone really got a lot of really great information out of this.
Thanks, Art. Thanks, everybody.
And with that being said, everyone else enjoy the rest of their day, and you will get that follow-up from us with the recording of this webinar as well as the white paper. And other than that, thank you, everybody.
Thanks.